"You're almost 30. Stop leeching," Dad said over Christmas dinner. I'd covered $3,000 a month in bills. Then started paying for their vacation house during my graduation. Then they posted a photo gifting my brother a Tesla for always being there. I just smiled. That night, I transferred every asset back to me and left a flash drive in Dad's desk labeled, "Good luck without me." I, 29M, sat at the Christmas dinner table, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, as my father's words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. He told me I was almost 30 and needed to stop leeching off them. My mother nodded along, dabbing at her mouth with a napkin, while my younger brother smirked into his wine glass. The thing about being called a leech is that it stings differently when you've been the one keeping the lights on. But I didn't say anything. I just set down my fork, smiled politely, and excused myself to the bathroom. My hands shook as I gripped the sink, staring at my reflection. The face looking back at me was tired, older than 29, worn down by 3 years of silence and sacrifice. Let me back up. 3 years ago, my father's business hit a rough patch. He owned a mid-sized manufacturing company that supplied parts to automotive companies, and when 2 of his biggest clients went under, the domino effect was brutal. My mother worked as a realtor, but the market had tanked around the same time. They were hemorrhaging money, facing foreclosure on their house, and my father's pride wouldn't let him file for bankruptcy or ask for help from anyone outside the family. I had just finished my MBA and landed a solid position at a consulting firm. The salary was good, really good for someone fresh out of graduate school. When my father called me into his study that night, his face gray with stress, and explained the situation, I didn't hesitate. He asked if I could help temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. He said 6 months, maybe a year at most. I started covering $3,000 a month in bills. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, car payments for both their vehicles. My father said he'd pay me back with interest once the business recovered. We shook hands on it. I trusted him. 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into 2. The business did recover, slowly but surely. I saw the signs. New equipment being purchased, hiring freezes lifted, my father's stress lines smoothing out. But the conversation about paying me back never happened. Whenever I brought it up gently, he'd change the subject or tell me we'd discuss it later. Then came my graduation ceremony for a specialized certification I'd been working toward. It was important to me, a milestone in my career path. My parents couldn't make it because they'd purchased a vacation house upstate. They told me about it casually over the phone, mentioned they needed to be there for the closing and some immediate renovations. They said they were sure I'd understand. I stood alone at my graduation, watching other people's families take photos and celebrate. I told myself it was fine, that I was an adult and didn't need my parents there. But it hollowed out something inside me. A month after that, I was still covering the bills. I'd paid out roughly $108,000 by then, not counting the additional money I'd funneled toward the vacation house renovations when they'd asked. My father had mentioned they were short on the contractor payment, and I'd wired $15,000 without question. Then another $10,000 for furnishings. I was living in a modest apartment, driving a 7-year-old sedan, eating meal prep to save money. My friends invited me on trips I couldn't afford. I turned down a promotion that would have required relocation because I couldn't abandon my financial commitment to my parents. My entire life had narrowed to work, bills, and waiting for a conversation that never came. My brother, 26, still lived at home. He worked a comfortable 9-to-5 at a tech startup, spent his money on hobbies and nights out. He was charming, easygoing, the golden child who could do no wrong. I'd never resented him for it, not really. We'd been close once. Christmas Eve arrived, and my mother asked me to come early to help set up. I drove the 2 hours to their house, the same house I'd kept from foreclosure, and spent the afternoon hanging lights and arranging furniture. My brother showed up an hour before dinner, cracked a few jokes, and was immediately praised for making time in his busy schedule. Dinner started pleasantly enough. My mother had outdone herself with the cooking, and the house smelled like rosemary and roasted vegetables. We talked about nothing important: weather, sports, a new restaurant in town. Then my father started talking about responsibility and success, his favorite dinner conversation topic. He looked at my brother with pride, talking about how well he was doing, how mature he'd become, how he'd really found his footing. Then his eyes shifted to me. He said I was almost 30 now, and it was time I started acting like it. He said I needed to stop depending on them for everything and start building my own life. He said I was leeching, that I needed to learn what it meant to stand on my own 2 feet. The room went silent. My mother looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. My brother stared at his plate. I felt something crack inside my chest, something that had been fracturing for 3 years, but had finally shattered completely. I excused myself. In the bathroom, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my banking records, my payment confirmations, the entire financial paper trail I'd kept meticulously. Every transfer to their mortgage company, every utility payment, every wire for the vacation house. I documented everything because some part of me had known I might need proof someday. When I returned to the table, I ate the rest of my meal in silence. My father seemed satisfied with whatever point he thought he'd made. After dinner, my mother brought out gifts. I received a sweater and a gift card. Practical, impersonal. My brother got a new watch, expensive leather, something he'd been wanting. I left before dessert, claiming an early morning. My mother hugged me, told me not to be a stranger. My father shook my hand, told me to think about what he'd said. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, my mind spinning through 3 years of choices and sacrifices and silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started making calls. By morning, I had a plan. The asset transfers were easier than I'd expected. 3 years ago, when my father's business was circling the drain, I'd done more than just cover bills. He'd asked me to co-sign on several business loans, to put my name on certain accounts as collateral. He'd needed my good credit, my financial stability, to secure the lending he needed to keep operating. I'd agreed because I trusted him, because family helped family. What he'd forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, was that my name on those accounts meant I had access. Legal access. I'd been making minimum payments on several of those loans for the past 2 years when his contributions mysteriously stopped. I had authorization on the business credit lines. I was listed as a co-owner on certain equipment purchases for tax purposes, he'd explained vaguely at the time. Over the next week, I worked with a lawyer. A good one, expensive, worth every penny. We went through every document, every contract, every signature. What we discovered was that my father had been far more reckless than I'd realized. In his desperation to save his business, he'd tangled our finances together in ways that gave me significant legal standing. I started unwinding it all. The cosign loans, I refinanced in my name only and immediately transferred them to accounts he couldn't access. The business credit lines, I paid off in full using my savings and closed them. The equipment I was listed as co-owner on, I had transferred to a holding company I'd set up. Every single financial thread that connected us, I cut it cleanly and completely. It took 2 weeks of working late nights, signing documents, making calls. My lawyer warned me that there might be family fallout, and I told him I was counting on it. On New Year's Eve, my brother posted a photo on social media. It showed him standing next to a brand new Tesla, midnight blue, perfect condition. The caption read something about starting the new year right. My mother had commented with heart emojis. My father had written that he was proud, that this was a gift for always being there when they needed him. I stared at that photo for a long time. A Tesla, probably $60,000 at minimum. While I'd been eating rice and beans to save money, while I'd been turning down promotions and postponing my own life, they'd been saving up to buy my brother a luxury electric car. For always being there. I just smiled. It was funny, in a dark way, how clarity arrived. I'd been waiting for acknowledgement, for appreciation, for some sign that my sacrifices mattered. But this was my sign. This photo of a car worth more than half of what I'd paid to keep their house, given to my brother for simply existing as the favored son. That night, I finished the last of the transfers. I compiled every document, every bank statement, every record of payment I'd made on their behalf. I organized it all onto a flash drive, labeled it clearly, and included a detailed spreadsheet showing exactly what I'd paid, when, and for what. The total came to $133,000 over 3 years. I also included the loan documents, the credit line closures, the equipment transfers, everything I'd unwound. And I added a simple letter, typed and professional, explaining that since I was being called a leech and told to stand on my own feet, I was taking his advice. I was removing myself from all financial entanglements with them. The loans were now solely my responsibility, paid off and closed. The equipment was transferred. The business would need to establish new credit lines and financing on its own merit. I drove to their house at 2 in the morning on New Year's Day. I knew they'd be asleep, exhausted from whatever party they'd attended. I used my key to let myself in quietly, walked to my father's study, and placed the flash drive in the center of his desk. The label faced up, clearly visible in the moonlight coming through the window. Good luck without me. I left my key on top of the flash drive. I walked out of that house and drove back to my apartment as the sun started rising on the new year. Update 1. The call started 3 days later. My father first. Early morning, his voice tight with controlled anger. He asked what I thought I was doing, demanded I call him back immediately. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the whole thing. My mother called an hour later, her voice confused and hurt. She asked why I would do something like this, said we needed to talk like a family. I didn't pick up. My brother sent a text asking if I'd lost my mind. I blocked his number. The emails came next. Long paragraphs from my father about betrayal, about family loyalty, about how I was destroying everything he'd built. He said I'd overreacted to a simple comment at dinner, that I was being childish and vindictive. He claimed I had no legal right to the assets I transferred, threatened lawyers and lawsuits. I forwarded all his emails to my lawyer, who sent back a very formal letter explaining exactly what legal rights I had and didn't have. Every transfer had been legitimate. Every signature had been mine to give. My father could threaten all he wanted, but he'd tied our finances together, and I'd simply untied them. The thing he hadn't realized, the thing I'd discovered through all those documents, was just how dependent his business had become on my financial backing. Those credit lines I'd closed had been floating him for months. The equipment I'd transferred was leased by the business at below market rates because I'd been listed as owner. Without those safety nets, his company was suddenly exposed. I didn't take any pleasure in it. I just felt empty. My mother showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning. I saw her through the peephole and almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. I opened the door. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. She asked if she could come in, and I stepped aside. We sat in my living room, the same cheap furniture I'd been making do with for years, and she cried. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this, that family was supposed to stick together. She said my father had only been trying to motivate me, that he wanted to see me succeed. I asked her if she'd known. Known what? She asked. Known how much money I'd been paying. Known that I'd covered their mortgage for 3 years. Known that I'd funded their vacation house. Known that I'd sacrificed my own savings, my own opportunities, my own future to keep them afloat. She went quiet. Then she admitted she'd known I was helping with bills, but didn't know the exact amounts. She said my father had handled the finances, that she'd trusted him to work it out with me. She said she'd thought it was a loan, that of course they'd been planning to pay me back. I asked her when. When were they planning to pay me back? She didn't have an answer. I told her about the Tesla. I asked her how they could afford a $60,000 car for my brother, but couldn't afford to acknowledge the $133,000 I'd paid to save their house. I asked her how they could miss my graduation for a vacation house I'd helped fund, but show up for my brother's birthday party last month. I asked her why I was called a leech when I'd been the one keeping them from drowning. She didn't have answers for those either. She left after an hour, her makeup ruined from crying, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just that same hollow emptiness. Update 2. A month passed. I threw myself into work, finally accepted that promotion I'd been putting off. It required relocation to a different city, a fresh start, and I took it without hesitation. The salary increase was substantial, enough that I could finally start rebuilding my savings. My lawyer called to inform me that my father had indeed consulted with an attorney but had been advised that he had no legal recourse. Everything I'd done was within my rights. The loans had been co-signed, which meant I had every right to refinance and assume full responsibility. The equipment transfers were legitimate based on the ownership documents. My father's lawyer had apparently told him he'd been financially reckless and that I'd simply cleaned up a mess he'd created. The business was struggling now. I heard through an old family friend that my father had to lay off several employees, that he was scrambling to establish new credit lines at higher interest rates because his business credit had taken a hit without my backing. The vacation house had been put up for sale. They were downsizing, cutting expenses, dealing with the reality of their actual financial situation without my safety net. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. 3 years of my life had been consumed by trying to help people who'd never appreciated it, who'd seen my generosity as weakness, my sacrifice as obligation. My brother reached out through a mutual friend. He wanted to meet for coffee. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. He looked uncomfortable when he showed up, fidgeting with his coffee cup. He apologized for the Tesla post, said he hadn't known about any of the money I'd been paying. He claimed our parents had told him they were doing fine, that the business had recovered. He said if he'd known, he would never have accepted such an expensive gift. I asked him if he'd give it back now that he knew. He went quiet, stared at his coffee. Eventually, he admitted he couldn't, that he'd already signed the title transfer, that it would complicate things. But he wanted me to know he felt bad about it. I told him feeling bad was easy. Making different choices was hard. He left looking deflated, and I went back to packing for my move. Update 3. 6 months after that Christmas dinner, I settled into my new city, my new position, my new life. I'd built up a small circle of friends who knew nothing about my family situation. I dated casually. I bought a new car, nothing as flashy as a Tesla, but reliable and mine. I started saving aggressively, planning for a future that was finally my own. My mother sent occasional emails, brief updates about their lives, carefully worded to avoid mentioning anything financial. She said the vacation house had sold quickly, that they were adjusting. She said my father was working hard to rebuild. She never asked me for help again. She never directly apologized either, just vague statements about wishing things had gone differently. I responded politely but briefly. I didn't cut them off completely, but I didn't offer anything beyond surface-level courtesy. The distance felt necessary, protective. My father never reached out directly. I heard through my mother that he'd been angry for months, that he'd felt betrayed and blindsided. She said he'd recently started saying he understood why I'd done it, that he'd made mistakes. But he never called, never wrote, never said any of that to me directly. His pride, I supposed, wouldn't allow it. A year after I left, I received a letter. Physical mail, my mother's handwriting. Inside was a check for $15,000 and a note explaining it was the first installment of paying me back. She said they'd set up a payment plan, that it would take years, but they wanted to make it right. The note was signed by both of them. I stared at that check for a long time. $15,000 against $133,000. It would take them nearly 9 years at that rate, and that was assuming they never missed a payment. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to send it back with a note saying I didn't want their money anymore. But I deposited it, not because I needed it, but because I wanted them to follow through. I wanted them to understand the weight of what I'd carried. Every few months after that, another check arrived. Sometimes on time, sometimes late, but they came. My mother's notes grew longer, more personal. She wrote about how they'd downsized their house, how they were learning to live more simply. She wrote about how my father had changed, become more careful, more humble. She wrote about missing me. I never wrote back with more than a brief acknowledgement. I didn't know them absolution, but I didn't hate them either. I'd moved past that into something more complicated. Understanding without reconciliation, clarity without closure. 2 years after everything fell apart, I met someone. She was brilliant and kind, worked in environmental law, had her own complicated family history. We moved in together after 8 months. When she asked about my family, I told her the truth, all of it. She listened without judgment and said something that stuck with me. Some people only learn to appreciate what they have after it's gone, and that's their tragedy to carry, not mine. We got engaged a year later. I called my mother to tell her. She cried, said she was happy for me, asked if they were invited to the wedding. I told her I'd think about it. I talked it over with my fiancé, and she left it entirely up to me, said she'd support whatever I decided. In the end, I sent an invitation. Not because I'd forgiven everything, but because I'd built a new life and I wasn't afraid of them being on the periphery of it anymore. They showed up, dressed modestly, on their best behavior. My father shook my hand and said he was proud of me. I thanked him politely. My brother gave an awkward toast about family and second chances. I smiled through it. They stayed for the reception and left early. My mother hugged me goodbye, whispered that she loved me and was sorry. I told her I knew. My father nodded once, his eyes red-rimmed, and walked away without saying anything else. The checks kept coming. As of last month, they'd paid back $47,000. At this rate, they'll finish in another 5 years. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. It doesn't define me anymore. I built the life my father told me to build that Christmas night. I stood on my own feet. I stopped leeching. The irony isn't lost on me that I had to burn down the bridge between us to do it, that his words became a self-fulfilling prophecy he never intended. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd spoken up at that dinner table. If I'd laid out everything right there in front of the roasted vegetables and Christmas lights. If I demanded acknowledgement and respect instead of swallowing my pride and planning revenge. But then I remember the Tesla, the vacation house, my missed graduation, 3 years of silence and sacrifice and being invisible. And I know that confrontation wouldn't have changed anything. Some lessons can only be learned through loss. Some people only hear you when you stop speaking altogether. I don't regret leaving that flash drive. I don't regret the asset transfers or the closed accounts or walking away. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my family couldn't see what they had until it was gone. I regret the years I spent waiting for appreciation that never came. But I don't regret building a new life. I don't regret choosing myself. And I don't regret learning that sometimes the most important person to stop leeching off of is yourself. To stop draining your own future for people who won't even notice the sacrifice. My father told me to grow up. So I did. Just not in the way he expected.